Okay, good afternoon, everyone.
Good
Good
afternoon.
afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Melanie Carter. I'm the Associate Provost and Director of the Center for HBCU Research, Leadership, and Policy here at Howard University, and so we're certainly pleased that you came out to join us this afternoon. Our program today is entitled The Economic Power of HBCUs Driving Growth and Opportunity, and it's co-sponsored by the Office of Strategy and also, of course, the HBCU Center. We see this as part of our what we call Howard at the Center series, where we can really discuss and identify issues that are of particular relevance to Howard University. And it's also a part of the Real Talk series from the Office of Strategy. And they're certainly looking to engage in important conversations that will influence and inform the development of the university's strategic plan. So with these um, this collaboration, I think, is extremely important, and it speaks to how critical this topic is to HBCUs. So again, the title of the program is The Economic Power of HBCUs, Driving Growth and Opportunity. And it's really centered around a UNCF, the United Negro College Fund, Frederick Patterson Institute's 2024 report entitled Transforming Futures, the Economic Engine of HBCUs. And so we're really pleased to have with us some of the authors of the report, some of the researchers that actually did the work to generate the findings and recommendation contained. And we're surely going to have a great discussion around the report and what it portends for all of us. So on our panel today, we have three, as I said, researchers and scholars and authors of the report to engage with us. So first we have Dr. Nadria Njuko, who is an HBCU scholar and also founder of the SIN. She was former director of the Frederick Patterson Institute. We also have Dr. Natasha McClendon, who now is director of the Center of Excellence for Black Women in STEM at Spelman College. And we also have Dr. Terrence Tarver, a Howard alum, right? Okay. Who is legislative director of public policy and government affairs at UNCF. So we have a great panel. We have a lot of great questions. I'm sure too many questions, more questions than they could possibly answer, but we're going to try to give it a shot. Okay. So again, the intention here again is to really examine the economic impact of HBCUs, highlight key data and recommendations from the report, and explore how these findings can inform strategic initiatives at Howard University and beyond. And so I'm just going to first ask the panelists to provide some opening statements about the report, and then I'll follow with a series of questions about the report. And we'll start right here with Dr. Njoko.
All right. Thank you, guys. Hi, everybody. How is everybody doing today? I'm excited to see everybody. I'm coming from Atlanta, where it's hovering between 40 and 50 degrees, not 10 and 20 with flurries and impending snow. So I appreciate you guys coming out. For the report, I'd say that I spent almost 6 years at the United Negro College Fund working in the Patterson Research Institute, starting as an embedded member of our Institute for Capacity Building and then leading the research agenda. And I would say that this report, for the entirety of the time that I was at UNCF until I left recently, was a huge goal of mine to replicate, because as I came in, it was a brand new baby in 2017, and it was being touted and used a lot by public policy and government affairs and researchers in general. But it was something that we all collectively felt we needed, but we knew at the time we wouldn't be able to fund. Like, it's not the type of report you can fund on an annual basis. It may not even make sense to reproduce annually. But by the time I became director and started to wrap up my agenda at Patterson, it was something that I certainly feel was a feather in my cap to be able to pull off. Because not only was it something that Patterson really needed essentially to build its footprint, but it's a huge tool in the toolbox of UNCF and HBCU advocates to make a value proposition that is not bipartisan but nonpartisan, based on its facts and figures.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Njoku, for sharing that. It's a privilege as well as an honor to be back home at the Mecca. I am Dr. Terrence Tarver. I am the Director of Government Affairs, Public Policy, and Legislative at the United Negro College Fund. And prior to coming to the UNCF, I was under the directorship as under Dr. Ivory Tosin at the White House Initiative on Historically Black College. This particular title
Dr.
to our
Carver,
historic.
please make sure you're talking into the report because I
Okay.
think the recording,
Okay.
the folks back there can't hear us. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
This particular economic report is very important institutions in order to thrive and guide for our economic stability. I wanted to point out that this report underscores a vital role that HBCUs play in promoting social mobility and economic growth, despite the facing chronic underfunding. So we're very glad to be here, and we're open the floor for for questions from Dr. Carter. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Yes, I'll say as a researcher committed to research, empirical research on HBCUs, we really saw it in Frederick T. Patterson Research Institute as an opportunity to really support the advocacy of HBCUs that might not always have the capacity to do this research on their own, but to provide something that gives back to what we see as our community, to help them to advocate for themselves and build narratives around what their strengths are as institutions with different strengths across the board, across these metrics that we're going to share more about.
All right, thank you very much. Certainly, Patterson Institute is without a doubt an invaluable resource for all researchers. I mean, the research they produce, we certainly constantly rely on to provide us with perspective and really identify questions or ways in which to frame our conversations about HBCUs. So this report and others, the center and other folks certainly rely on it heavily. And so we appreciate the work that you've done at UNCF and the Patterson Institute, and certainly this report is a stellar example of that work. So my first question is, if someone hasn't yet had a chance to read this report, and if you scan the QR codes around the room, you certainly can have access to the report. But if they haven't had a chance to read it, how would you describe its aim and its impact?
Absolutely. So, the report is designed to be a sort of a quick cheat sheet for institutions to understand their economic impact through job creation, student spending, and synthetic life earnings. Um, Terrence is going to explain more about how we use it at UNCF to advocate for institutions, but I'll give you a quick high level takeaways. So, the report that we released distinguishes HBCUs as generating 16.5 billion in direct economic impact on the national economy. Those numbers primarily come from the total numbers of jobs created, student spending, and then projected lifetime earnings of the class of 2021. If you were to place HBCUs amongst Fortune 500s on the amount of jobs that they create, we found that they create more than 136,000 jobs. They would be in the top 50 of Fortune 500. So as a collective, on average, each job created on campus produces 1.5 off-campus jobs. So we're not just talking about the on-campus jobs created, but off-campus. And Natasha will share more about what distinguishes Howard within the report itself. And Terrence sort of tapped into social mobility. Patterson, as well as other scholars, have done work on social mobility of HBCU graduates, and we have found that HBCUs are more successful in moving the bottom 40 of this country's income distribution to the top 60. So students move incrementally high in their economic income levels, but I think it's most important to talk about HBCUs and across the spectrum are distinguished in moving them incrementally over income levels, but there are some institutions like Howard University where they move from the bottom to the top in one graduating class.
If I can add to that, Nadria, This particular report, it calls for equitable and sustainable funding to ensure that HBCUs can continue the essential work in education and our economic development. So a lot of key points that you will take away from this report is that lifetime earnings for HBCU graduates, for 51,000 graduates from the class of 2021, can expect work-life earnings of $146 billion, which is $53 billion more than they have expected earns with less than degrees. So the economic impact, there's job creation, there's social mobility, and there's lifetime earnings. And before you came into the room, we had one of my colleagues, Brandon, pass out the economic report. And also within the packet, you'll have what Howard University produces within the region as well.
Yeah, so as Dr. Njoku mentioned, the main metrics for this study are institutional spending, student spending, job creation, also the dollar multiplier, so how long dollars are reintroduced and stay in the community, as well as projected earnings for the graduating classes. And when we look at Howard in comparison to all other HBCUs, we see that they have the second highest number in graduates, but the first in job creation on and off campus. So the highest numbers in job creation on and off campus, the highest in institutional spending and student spending, and the highest in projected synthetic lifetime earnings. So graduates from Howard has the highest projected earnings out of all HBCUs.
Wow, that's quite impressive. You know, certainly as we prepared for this session, and certainly read the report in late 2024, and certainly in many ways, many things have changed in terms of the climate, in terms of some of the opportunities and challenges before us. And so I'm just wondering how things differ based upon when the report was released and now. So at the time this report was released, there was an assumption about the argument about whether HBCUs are needed. And though I've never embraced that notion, but given this report, should those notions, and I think they're erroneous notions, be put to rest, given the findings of the report, and how has the discourse changed, and what would you say to that argument now?
Well, Dr. Carter, I'm glad you asked this question. The discourse around the necessity of historically black colleges and universities has evolved significantly, and we have to put this issue to bed, especially in the light of recent findings from this economic report. This report will highlight substantial contributions that our HBCUs make to the economy, generating $16.5 billion in direct economic impact and creating over 136,000 jobs. These institutions, they also play a crucial role in playing and promoting social mobility. HBCUs, with the earnings of significantly more than their lifetimes compared to those without degrees. So we have to understand that in recent years, the argument about the necessity of HBCUs have shifted towards recognizing our unique value and the urgent need for equitable funding. So the Supreme Court ruling against their affirmative action and the college admissions has further underscored the importance of HBCUs and the safe havens for minority students seeking supportive educational environments. Additionally, political discourse, especially during the 2024 presidential debates, has brought HBCU funding and support to the forefront, without candidates being questioned on their plans to address disparities and enhance the resources for our institutions. So given these developments, Dr. Carter, and the argument that HBCUs are no longer needed, answer yourself that question, seems increasingly outdated. Let's let that rest to bed. Because I take pride in that we had from Howard University a woman who stood the test of time rise to the ranks of vice president of these United States of America and then for presidential candidate of these United States of America. And where did she come from? She came from Howard University. So you ask yourself, are our institutions needed? Yes, we're needed now more so than ever.
Yeah. And I would add, I think that the questions around diversity, equity, inclusion puts a question in mind. When we first released this report, we felt we were like on the square of not having to ask that question. I think about how HBCUs got news coverage as I entered the field. Those questions were always sort of the headline. We shifted the headline from whether or not these institutions could survive to how they were thriving, the landmark donations, endowment growth, etc. What I think as a scholar and a member of the United Negro College Fund staff, that I really pride myself on is that we were able to, with this report and others, move away from these anecdotal stories exclusively, like the tradition of going to an HBCU or someone being a fourth, sometimes fifth generation graduate of an institution and how impactful that was for their family, to moving to, quantifiable facts that back those stories up, that put us further into a square of understanding that these institutions make an impact in their community. There is a genuine financial footprint of them being there, and if they were absent from that community, taking into consideration Howard's numbers, if Howard didn't exist, you would have 1.7 billion less in this community annually than you would have if they were here. So you can't argue with that. You can't argue with the fact that they employ 9,361 people on and off campus. That's not something you can argue politically. You could say is a DEI buzz, buzz phrase. Those are just numbers and facts,
Right.
and that's a nonpartisan argument that I think UNCF, as well as other institutions that we've talked to, have been able to take this report into the halls of any office, Congress, Senate, etc., and make a solid argument for allocations financially.
If I could just piggyback off of what Nadrea was talking about. So during our appropriations ask, when I talk to Republicans and I talk to Democrats, when we're doing our appropriation cycle every year, we have a potload of money that I ask for our institutions. So strengthening institutions, Title III Part B, Section 123-125, is one of the number one funding streams that HBCUs have a pool from. So we ask in that particular pool for $500 million. And so under that $500 million, you have 100 HBCUs that pull directly from that particular grant to govern our institutions. Of course, we ask for more. During a markup of a couple of months ago, in which Congress has not passed a 2025 budget, they only gave us in that particular area to build on our already $500 million, $7 million to increase. We're not the majority in Congress. We are the minority. But this holy grail helps me to prove my case when I talk to the representatives on Congress about what our HBCUs need.
I would also add that I think a lot of times in conversation, there is inherent value associated with some of these Fortune 500 companies that are creating less jobs than HBCUs. So when we talked about 136,000 jobs that are created by HBCUs, we don't ask Intel, is there any value to this company that doesn't create that many jobs? And all the other Fortune 500 companies that are not in the top 50 that create way less jobs and in fact fire more people and decrease the amount of jobs that are available for people. So I think it's also an idea of reframing how are we defining the value that different institutions provide when we're talking about $7.9 billion of potential earnings for one graduating class at one institution versus seeing companies that we tout as having really high impact, and all we're seeing from them is layoffs. So I think like reframing this question as well to think about how are we defining that value, and part of our mission was to really answer that question empirically and provide evidence to say it's not really the right question if you're asking if we're creating value as HBCUs. How are the other people creating value?
Right.
I love that. So much is swirling in my head. I mean, that I really just don't know where to begin. There are other questions. I'm going to ask these questions, okay? Other questions. I'm going to also open it up to those in the audience as well. But, one of the things One of the things I'm known to say is that there is no magic sauce. It drives me crazy when people talk about HBCUs as if there is a magic sauce. Because I always say, our narratives are folk tales. Other folks' narratives are empirical data. And so what you all do, the conversation here speaks to that, providing empirical data about the value of HBCUs is so incredibly important, and it helps to shift the conversation that often challenges the value we bring and forces people to examine the facts, right? The empirical data, as Dr. Njoku just said, can't be, is not partisan. I think it's extremely important. The other thing I would say in terms of the work of the Patterson Institute is that I'm certainly always immersed in research about HBCUs, and I don't read anything without seeing several phrases that come directly from your work. Punching above your weight. It's everywhere now, right? Outsized impact. All those things have really helped to change the discourse about HBCUs in some critical ways. So really, again, this whole, what you all just shared in terms of shifting the conversation and challenging these questions and asking not only what value HBCUs bring, but what value do others bring, I think is extremely important. So I appreciate the responses. And so as we think about those data points, are there any specific data points that you think should be illuminated writ large, broadly, across the HBCU landscape, but also about Howard particularly? You shared some already that are really quite amazing, but anything else in terms of any other data point that you want to speak to?
Start.
I think one of the things that's interesting when we dig deeper into the data is looking at how these numbers fall out. So when we see the impact of Howard, it is also because they have graduate programs, right? There are graduate programs, there are undergraduate programs, there are certificate programs. So it's also this holistic viewpoint of creating this value for the graduates by having all of these different types of opportunities to pursue doctoral, master's, bachelor's, associate degrees, certificates that add more value to their lives and more opportunities for them. So I think that's one thing that contributes to the narrative around success for Howard. But I think also one thing, and Dr. Njoku might speak a little bit more about this, is the idea that these jobs create futures in many different ways. So when we think about the jobs that are off campus, we're talking about catering, we're talking about small businesses, we're talking about anybody involved in events, we're talking about anybody connected to the campus for anything that the campus is doing. But when we talk about on-campus jobs, we're also talking about people who have the opportunity to send their children to college for free.
Absolutely.
And how does that impact social mobility for people? If they can work an honest job here and then have the ability to send their child to one of the highest achieving colleges in the nation, not amongst HBCUs, but period, for free, that creates social mobility immediately and creates impact immediately. So we want to think about how we see the impact of people being able to work on college campuses and create futures for their children and their family members as another way that this impacts, contributes to the impact that HBCUs have and Howard has.
Yeah. And if you guys go to I don't know if you got to wiggle the mouse, but
Okay,
if you go to the QR code or you go to UNCF's website where they feature the report, there should be a video there where we highlight a story of it's not a Howard story, but I think there probably, and I can be certain that there are stories like this. We highlight a story of a Xavier grad. His father worked in the cafeteria. His mother was the cheerleading coach, and he went to Xavier. He became a pharmacist. He talks about being able to afford a home immediately after graduating from that institution. So you can see the life cycle of a working class family being employed by these institutions and then producing a generation of students who are then able to afford things that their parents may have not afforded. In previous research, Patterson and UNCF has highlighted that within 6 years of graduation, those who are Pell eligible are likely not to be Pell eligible anymore. So we're talking about students who qualify or are in poverty and go into HBCUs and no longer in poverty immediately after graduation. And then I just also want to highlight that there are different levels of data that we weren't able to highlight in this research report because, as Terrence has highlighted, that they go into the halls of Congress and try to get a quick view on the fact sheets he distributed. So those are sheets where you're getting someone to understand your point within 2 or 5 minutes, right?
10 minutes. Elevator speech.
Right, your elevator speech. But if you had more time on the elevator or even had time to sit down, you would want to dig into the types of degrees that Howard University produces. They produce professional, doctors, masters, bachelors, certificates, postmasters. And so all of those degrees have different numbers attached to them related to synthetic work life. So for instance, in 2021 dollars, Howard graduated 2,370 students. Of those 2,000 or so students, 464 were professional degrees, and that represents 2.2 billion of the 7 billion that we say is projected work-life balance. However, if you look at the bachelor's degrees, they produced roughly 1,500 bachelor's degrees. That's 4.3 billion, right? So you have to look into the numbers themselves and start to articulate the value of the degrees themselves and use that as your calling card for the value proposition of this institution. And that is, if anyone comes up to you and asks you, why do you have a medical school? Why do you have a dentistry program? Why are you producing masters of education when someone might doubt the value of that master's degree or the value of the field of education? You can use real numbers, and these numbers are publicly accessible through iPads. So this is data that we were able to access for this institution. But if we dug deeper, maybe into your IR office, maybe there are even broader, deeper numbers you can dig into that we didn't have access to.
I do want to add one other thing. This was from a different study, but it's a related finding where we did a study on alumni peer relationships, mentoring, and satisfaction with their experiences at HBCUs. And one of the major findings we found was that there is a concerted ripple effect that HBCUs have. So when we have one student going to a HBCU, they might find a mentor, they graduate, they have a great experience, but then when they meet other people from a different HBCU, they say, oh, you went to a HBCU too. Okay, so we're a family in that regard. But then there's also this further ripple of, I didn't go to an HBCU, but my mentor went to a HBCU, and they have this kind of community-oriented framing. And so then they mentor me, and I become part of that family as well, even if I never went to an HBCU. So the return on investment is far more being a part of an HBCU network than it is being part of an Ivy League network. And so when we think about value, again, we want to think about that as a ripple effect that actually pays off and not like a projected maybe ripple effect of if you go to Harvard, maybe you'll have access to networks that will get you a better job, when in reality, when you're part of an HBCU network, it's almost guaranteed based on our findings.
We can see that with Terrence in the room. He already talked about it, right?
Well, can I just add a little bit more to it? I would like to congratulate Howard University on becoming R1 designation. So we talked about economic contributions, we talked about employment and vendor engagement, but we also have to look at the research and innovation that Howard University is the only HBCU to achieve the prestigious R1 designation, which signifies the highest level of research activity, and it demonstrates the capacity for the cutting edge scholarship and technological innovation. So on Congress, we're advocating for infrastructure funding. There's $50 million of infrastructure funding that will help our other schools gain this designation. So we assisted Howard in getting this particular designation over the years. But we have 100 HBCUs. So wouldn't it be fit if other HBCUs receive this same designation? So that's why we're on the halls of Congress fighting for our appropriations and for our other institutions to rise to the occasion, such as our Howard University now too as well.
Wow. I mean, you talk about reframing ROI. I love that because it's so important. And I also wonder, given some of the conversation and some of the decisions that are being made about some of the federal government data collection processes and sharing data from, and I'm just wondering what that will mean. I mean, because even you all raised some important questions, and I'm thinking, oh my, that would be really great to explore. How do we access that data? And if we don't have these structures in place, if the federal government doesn't continue to collect data in the way they've been collecting it, because some of this concern about so-called DEI or whatever in terms of difference, I just wonder what you think in terms of what kind of data will be made available or even collected that we could use to empirically support the value of HBCUs.
Yeah, and I know there are some organizations that are kind of crowdsourcing what publicly available data will still be available or trying to save it so that it is available for what we have remains available. But I think this is also an opportunity for HBCUs to collaborate on reprioritizing, collecting their own data, maintaining their own data, and for organizations, foundations that are committed to not bipartisan, nonpartisan existence of data that helps everybody make their decisions for them to also collaborate with HBCUs and increasing capacity for them to be able to do that. I think at UNCF, when we were there with Frederick D. Patterson Research Institute, that's something that we always try to support institutions in doing, in reaching out to them to see what data they actually wanted and needed and how we could collaborate with them to increase their capacity to create that and house it so that they have access to it, whether the government is producing it or not. Not because we thought that the government would not produce it, but because we see the value in them having access to their own data and creating their own data, understanding and using it for their to create narratives that support and advocate for them.
Yeah, and then to build on Dr. McClendon's points, I think as institutions think about how foundations and philanthropies can help institutions build capacity, institutional research is going to be a critical space to building capacity and funding because it'll be a place where, one, they can replicate these publicly accessible data sets, but also build upon them and also build in opportunities to innovate. For instance, with the Center for HBCU Research and Leadership and Policy, to think about how to fund and create programs in collaborations with institutional research. Perhaps there isn't a capacity for IR to build a research project, but the center can build that project out and supply new data sets, new metrics, and ways to collect that data. And it's going to be essential if we want to reproduce these reports and talk about the value propositions as this institution grows and deepens its R1 status.
So I'm wondering, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, that this is co-sponsored with the Office of Strategy. And they're certainly looking for ways that this report and its finding can inform the strategic, not only the process, but the actual plan itself. So in terms of thinking about the data, the findings, the recommendations from this report, how do you think that could be used perhaps to inform our strategic plan or others in terms of their strategic planning processes or goals?
So I think that it'll be important to understand and track the data around job creation, off campus, on campus, and also, if possible, partner with organizations to track spending of individual businesses off campus. Those are not metrics that we tracked in this report because it's not available on iPad. So we can't go to the student's favorite eatery and figure out how much they spend on an annual basis. If that eatery is on the brink of not surviving, I mean, what are some of the partnerships that Howard can build to continue to grow the community and ensure that off-campus jobs, independent Black-owned businesses thrive so that they can have those resources for their students We know that in urban communities, many HBCUs like to keep their students as close as possible to try to remain safe and hold their students tight, as the extension of their parents and families. So how can we invest in those partnerships and build healthy urban communities? Also, from a strategic perspective, as you think about the value proposition of particular degree programs, I mentioned this before, but all of the numbers of students who are produced and graduate in those degree programs produce numbers that add to the total number of impact of each institution on a yearly basis. So doing an evaluation of how much is students produce annually with bachelor's degrees, professional doctoral degrees. And then strategically, I think it's very important that institutions invest in looking at, we look at the synthetic earnings of one graduating class because that's within the capacity of this report. And it also makes the report consumable, but we don't publicly have available multiple class decades, an examination looking over time, decades, et cetera, how much your students produce over their lifetime. If it was 7.8 billion for this one particular class, that's one class.
That's right.
You can't imagine with 10, 20, 30, 100 classes over the life of Howard would mean for what Howard produces. The other thing that we've really been in depth, and we do know that Patterson is continuing to do this work, is sort of try to disaggregate how many doctors are produced by HBCUs, pharmacists, lawyers. I know that we often cite a very popular report that talks about, how many percentage of doctors are produced by HBCUs. I know that work is quite dated, and it's also, it was a collection of looking at who's who documents, if you know who's who in DC,
Sure.
who's who in Atlanta, looking at those books to see what those how that data shook out. But there's new work to be done, and I do believe that there's an opportunity for Howard to investigate. How many doctors, dentists, lawyers are distributed across this country and even globally after graduating from the university. And that's a space of investment for the strategy team.
And I always say that, HBCUs touch every nook and cranny of our nation and really the globe, because if, you didn't attend the HBCU, your teacher did, your minister, your doctor, your lawyer, your neighbor, and the ways in which I think that's a great potential study, and it speaks to this snowball impact that HBCUs have and have had since their beginnings. As I was saying earlier, again, I've been, as always, but really immersed in research on HBCUs. Just Friday, I think it was Friday, we had a program with Crystal Sanders at Emory, whose work is around segregation scholarships. It's great work. I'm also reading Deandra Rose's new book about Black excellence at HBCUs. Again, both of them rely heavily upon some of the work that you're doing, but again, speaks to this generational impact of HBCUs. And even though we talk about it often, quantifying it and providing some empirical support for it, I think is extremely exciting and certainly very much needed. Yeah. So thank you for that. And I'm just wondering, Dr. Tarver, as you're having these conversations in the halls of Congress, whether it's this administration or prior administrations, how receptive are they to these data points?
Wow. Particularly the Republicans, they love data.
Okay.
the Democrats, they love the story, they love the compelling story, but you're able to have a bipartisan effort when you not only tell the story but share the data as well. And so it's an
I'm gonna
art
write an
to it.
article. Share the story. And what was that about?
Uh,
Tell the story. Share the data. See what
telling
I'm
a
saying?
compelling story,
Okay,
but
there you go.
sharing the
I
data
love
as
that.
well. And
That's
and
very
so
important.
those two work tandem, hand in hand, in order to gain receptive outcomes to what we're trying to do for our institutions.
That's so important. That's very well said. Absolutely. Okay. All right. So let me just ask you for any closing remarks. Well, actually, before I ask you for closing remarks, I'm going to ask for questions from the audience. So, are there any pressing questions that you all have that you like to ask the panelists? Please do. See your hand, Dr. Jackson, Frank Jackson.
Hi, nice to meet you guys all. I love the report, reading it 2 weeks ago, actually. So I have quick questions. I'm heavily involved with my alumni association, and I'm also part of HBCU Alliance, the DC chapter. And so, I do wonder a couple of things. Like, we know that Biden, support last year was the biggest of many administrations, a federal support. What are some practical things that we can do? We can share the report, but I kind of feel like a lot of the alumni clubs feel a little paralyzed, right now in this stage of what to do. So would you have any suggestions of what we can do? I know for our Fifth Club, we've even thought about, planning a on the Hill day to really kind of talk about even private colleges. That was my research as well. But Fisk University, we're so small, we don't get federal support. So just really kind of really figure out what can we do, because at the same time we're a little bit nervous. We're right next door to Tennessee State, so but we are private, so that's the only great wonderful thing about it. As they are public, but just trying to figure out what we can really do. We can write op-eds, but just like to get some insight.
Well, I have a question. I want to tackle that question. Right now, coalition building is most important that we have in our demographics. So when you tell your story and another institution tell their story, and then one student tells their plight and the other student tells their plight, there's a common interest. There's the story. And so what we found in most recent and what's happening within the first 100 days of this new administration, we found that they've hit us with stories. They're just hitting story after story after story to see what would stick. And so if we do our coalition building and we continue to share our stories on different mediums platforms, whether you go on Blueface, I guess that's what it's called, or X, or go on Facebook, or whatever your, now they're doing, what's those platforms that a TEDx talk or something of those natures, make sure that you're gathering this body of knowledge to your shared experiences and sharing how these institutions are making an impact on not only the county or jurisdiction that you're in, but statewide as well. And that's going to get major attention and traction as well. Because what it does is the representative and or the congressman that oversees your particular school, that's going to get up and they're going, well, have you paid attention to this? Or they're doing some great things over at Fisk University, or they're doing some awesome things at Tennessee State, and that's going to get traction. So why, when we come in as the fixers, and we're talking about these shared experiences, because I know about that school because they have a great alumni association, and they're talking about what this institution is producing. So collective stories and coalition building.
Yeah, I'm a graduate of Xavier University of Louisiana, and I was looking for the hashtag. I'm a big believer in social media and growing your footprint there. But I'll share with Dr. Carter if I find it. But there's a project. There's a guy. It was a rabbit hole I went down when Morehouse did their polo collection. There's a guy who graduated from Morehouse who's a creative director of men's clothing at Ralph Lauren.
Okay.
But I guess the one of the guys who did the actual campaign footage is a Tuskegee grad, and he is doing a Tuskegee photo project on Instagram and asking alum to donate, photos from decades ago. They're trying to create an archive of vintage photos from Tuskegee, and Fisk is ripe for that kind of thing as well. And so it's just about tapping into the emotional story that alumni continue to return with. And I think we talked about, Natasha and I talk about this all the time. We talk about economic impact. Homecoming is, another one of those marquee items where, like, marquee moments where people just return back and come home and have this huge economic footprint. And, so I think showing up for your school in all platforms is infectious, and it cuts across time.
Yeah, I think another point that Nadria and I have talked about a lot is this idea of helping others to see what each institution is uniquely well endowed to produce. So, like, what is Fisk really good at doing that another institution might not? I wouldn't say not do well, but each institution has their thing, right? So, yeah, their own identity, their own thing that they produce or cultivate in students. And so that might not be the same as a TSU, right? Mm-hmm. It's not the same experience, but really leaning into what it is that you have to offer. And then also, as Terrence was saying, like, promote that with the facts as well. Like, this is the impact that we're having by doing that thing so well.
I like that. All right.
I really appreciate the report, and especially this notion of, like, combining all the information to get that collective impact. And so I'm wondering, for Howard specifically, given its legacy and its history, what role should Howard play, or what role can it play in lifting the boat for all HBCUs?
Yeah, Natasha highlighted that in all the categories but one, Howard is first, in numbers. And in that one category, it isn't first, it's second. It only comes second to North Carolina, A&T. I think Howard continues to set the standard on storytelling. And, you can see that storytelling's impact with the record number of applications. You can only control a room, and you only have so many, seats to fill in the classroom. But continuing to tell your story, and then bringing other institutions along with you in that. And I think Howard could also set the standard in creating a best practice manual for other institutions on how you do what you do, right? Branding is huge for this institution, and I'm not in your financial coffers, right? But if capacity isn't a need in branding, but capacity is a need in branding for other institutions, how can Howard then assist in creating a collaborative effort in showing other institutions how to brand themselves and become marquee institutions? The same is correct with, financial management. I think it's about sharing the knowledge. It's about knowledge sharing. And Howard certainly could lead the pack in that.
I also think, in terms of what Dr. Njoku just shared, if Howard is not always going to have the space for undergraduates, they might have that space for graduate students, right, in graduate programs. And so sharing that and collaborating with other institutions, knowing that if they go to an HBCU for undergrad, they might be more willing or more inclined to go to Howard for grad school or another HBCU for grad school. So seeing that as a net win if they come to Fisk for undergrad and then they go to Howard for their doctoral degree. It's still a win. And so thinking about that as a holistic viewpoint of the responsibility is still there to contribute to other undergraduate institutions' success, because that's success for Howard later down the line.
All right, great. Dr. Mickey.
Yeah, I was thinking there's a lot of anxiety right now in higher education broadly about federal appropriations and what that could be to the research enterprise of our organization. Certainly for Howard University, that's a number one concern there right now. Is in a lot of the minds of faculty at the university, particularly those that are research active. How concerned should we be about this climate? And what do you recommend for faculty to be putting their energy towards so that we can continue to do the things that we have done, beyond achieving our one classification? I think that's just a tiny drop in the bucket of a bucket of the things that we're doing. But what should we do? How should we respond? Where do you think we should channel our energy?
I think how we should respond is with transparency and accountability. We were, as you know, that this one individual cannot take away or do what he's doing. That it takes Congress to take away funds and to eliminate the Department of Education. Our senior officials at the United Negro College Fund have been in contacts and have been in meetings with the incoming Secretary of Education, and she has assured that certain programs within the Department of Education, as it relates to HBCUs, it's safeguarded. And so what we have to do is that if information is not coming down from your coalition, from Thurgood Marshall and or UNCF and or NAFIO, is just to be really guarded on not being overreactive with emotions, but actually looking to see what's really in black and white and what you see that things are coming down the pipeline with. Because they'll put stuff out there that will make you nervous and anxious, and then that's not really what's happening. So clear out the noise.
Yeah, and from an academic, the point of view of an academic is about coalition building as well, right? You know, we know colleagues who work at quote unquote flagship state funded institutions have resources and networks to philanthropies and organizations, and they build on their contracts as faculty. You know, they get tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars independently contracting. And so I think it would be great if the School of Education led a coalition of faculty, you know, that created an organization that helps to employ those different independent contracts, right? Like, imagine, Jorge, if you led a contract group of HBCU faculty to do evaluations and assessments that these philanthropies or these outside organizations really need, right? You have a point of view, and you subversively can inform some of these agendas that are being taken out at the highest level.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Yeah, Kari Pastena from the Center for an Equitable Economy and Sustainable Society. Excuse me, losing my voice here. Hopefully I'm not coming down with anything. But a couple of questions. Question number one, I guess, would be for UNCF. Given that this is the first study of its kind, are plans underway to replicate the study, perhaps on a decennial basis every 10 years, to create a data set that would be useful over time? And then number two, given the outside role that HBCUs play in diaspora, right? I know you referred to this in your previous comment. Did the study disaggregate for diaspora, Caribbean, Africa, the rest of America? And if there were to be a supplementary report, another report, would this be the kind of information that we would look to produce?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I would say that this report is the third in a series of reports produced. We collaborated with the University of Georgia Silic Center for Economics with Dr. Jeffrey Humphreys. In 2006, he actually produced this report exclusively for iPads, and the leadership at the United Negro College Fund in Patterson saw that report and had it reproduced and funded his research in 2017. And so we collaborated with Dr. Humphreys again in 2024 to produce this data. And Dr. Humphreys and UNCF rely solely on iPads data through the National Center for Education Statistics. So this is actually the third in a series. And so, yes, I do believe that it's very important. And it's a marquee study of UNCF and Patterson, and they will continue to produce it. Patterson also produces Punching Above Their Weight, which uses some of the same iPads data to talk about graduation rates and the percentage of Black students who graduate from HBCUs compared to the percentage of Black students that graduate from white institutions. And they comparatively see that HBCUs overproduce graduates in that that demographic. That being said, I really appreciate your question about disaggregating within the diaspora. Unfortunately, that isn't the kind of disaggregation that IPEDS produces. If they produced it publicly, we would use it. But we go as granular as they will allow. And I think that is another answer to the question of how Howard can lead in this research, or how we could take and further this research with a privately funded effort, is to disaggregate at that level, to look at African immigrants, Caribbean immigrants, students we know populate this campus at a high level, but just don't come up in the data in the way we like to see them publicly.
I do want to add that we did do some deeper research and conversation with the University in the Virgin Islands, which is the only HBCU that's not in the continental, U.S. And so we were trying to really pull apart that kind of question around, like, how do we understand their experience as an institution that is technically part of the U.S., but more of what we would understand as diasporic experience. And speaking with some of their leadership, just understanding, like, a lot of people don't know that they exist or that they're an HBCU, and what are the differences of experience there? What kind of value are they able to offer that is different from what people expect of HBCUs? And so we did start to try to pull that apart and learn more and collaborate with them to give them more capacity to kind of tell more of their story around that.
Thank you.
Great.
Quick question.
Sure.
iPad. What is it?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Now you got it.
Institutional
use it.
perspective.
Yeah, you guys answer, because I always say iPads, but it is produced by the National Center for Educational Statistics. And what is the acronym?
It's Integrated Post-Secondary Educational Statistics
Data.
Data.
or something.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yes.
something.
Right.
Absolutely. And it is actually the data set that institutions are required to submit to get their federal allocation. So every institution is required to get financial aid for their students.
Right.
So it's something that institutions submit on an annual basis, but I will say that it is delayed roughly 2 or 3 years because it takes time to turn that data around.
Right.
Thank you for that.
That's a great question. All right. Well, again, thanks to everyone, your great questions. But I want to ask the panel to provide us with some, just use a minute or so to share any concluding thoughts and about the report, or what you think we should take away from the report and from the panel today.
So I will borrow Terrence's tagline of tell the story, show the
I
data.
love that.
Because I think that's really our approach. And so a lot of times we don't devalue these qualitative or anecdotal stories, because I think that really helps to, for lack of a better word, like create the vibe. So the vibe is important, especially in our community, and I think that can't be understated. But I think having the data to also combat the questions of people who might not get the vibe or catch the vibe helps us to really argue what our value is and challenge what others' value is.
Yeah. Before Dr. Carper goes, I want to say that we have to thank UNCF for creating the space to do this work. And although Natasha and I are no longer at the United Negro College Fund, we really value that time and value our colleagues there who create an opportunity for us to do this research. It's not research that is often popular. Organizations don't often want to invest in it, but UNCF, as we like to call the U, is its own institution. And so it creates opportunities for us to ask these questions so that they can do their work, but we can inform and build on the knowledge of HBCUs.
Thanks for having me. I would just like to say that a college education opens the door for economic prosperity. And what we have to do is that when we finish our degrees, we have to reach back and embrace the spirit of Sankofa, reach back and look forward, take someone with us. And when they talk about our HBCUs still significant, yes, they're significant. Why? Because you're sitting here today. Why? Because you want to make a significant impact in today's society. Why? Because you want to see change happens. And where does change normally happen? It happens in the classrooms. It happens with the individuals that don't make enough money, but they are embedding in us what our skills and abilities, what we need to do to go on and be productive citizens. So continue to tell the story, but actually have the data along with that story. And that's going to show the impact. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. This has been a fantastic panel. So let's give them a round of applause. Outstanding researchers and outstanding advocates for HBCUs. And I'm a qualitative researcher, so I certainly believe in the narrative. But at the same time, this, again, so when you peruse our website and you see that tagline, okay, I'll give you credit, Dr. Tarver, but okay. I shall be using it. But again, I want to thank the panel. They've traveled to get here to do this important session. We have the report that really adds value to our thinking about HBCUs. And as someone who has sort of grown a little weary of late, this certainly gives me great hope that we will continue to do, certainly at HBCUs, but also share the story of our institutions in ways that have impact and also is generative. So again, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks to the Office of Strategy for co-sponsoring this event, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.